All right, guys. So thank you very much. This is my week 7 PowerPoint presentation for exceptional child, and this one is emotional and behavioral disorders. So there we go. So what are emotional and behavioral disorders? Well, according to the CDC, mental disorders, which they include in emotional behavior disorders, among children are described as the serious changes in the way children typically learn, behave, or handle their emotions, which causes distress and problems throughout the day. So it's a little bit different than, say, just a normal child who is acting up. It's a different thing. Students with emotional behavioral disorders have a harder time controlling that, not due to will of their own, but because of some kind of underlying issue that surrounds that. And that goes a few different directions. As we see here, a few examples that the CDC provides are anxiety and depression, behavioral disorders, obsessive compulsive disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're just going to be focusing on the first two, anxiety and depression and behavioral disorders. So the first thing that we are going to look at is the behavioral disorder side of the things. So we have oppositional defiant disorders and we have conduct disorders. So behavioral disorders and oppositional defiant disorder are listed as usually they start before the age of 8, but no later than the age of 12. Defiance is normally directed towards people who the child knows well. So typically the opposition and the defiance isn't directed towards strangers who they don't know. They still have that kind of childlike shyness when it comes to new people, but if they know the person, they interact with the person throughout the day, typically that's the people who they feel the most comfortable with and where this is really going to come out the most. So behavioral examples include these children are often angry or they lose their temper. They argue with adults, refusing to comply with adults' rules or requests. They're resentful and spiteful, deliberately annoying others or becoming annoyed with others, and often blaming their other people for their own mistakes or behavior. So as a teacher, you can kind of see how this can be a handful. I know in the past, Cassidy's talked about how she's worked as a substitute teacher and kind of how that works, and when we were discussing in our discussion forum. But what about you, Ethan? Have you ever experienced a child with a behavioral disorder beyond just the normal acting out?
I have my guesses, but you never really know. You always think they just might be just kids.
Yeah, and that's kind of the hard nature of this specific disorder, because sometimes kids are just going to be kids and do kids things and act up because they're kids, but sometimes they're going to be acting up because of a disorder that they have, and it's kind of hard to tell the difference. And that's why a lot of the research for this topic really is diving into the psychology and psychiatric side of thing, which isn't really something that we as teachers can dive into too much. But that's definitely something that if you're noticing this kind of trend and things like that, that's where open lines of communication with parents are so important to make sure that everyone's on the same page with this. So after that, we have the oppositional defiant disorders. And like I said, I think this is just a copy of the note before, but here we go. Here's a new slide. Behavioral disorders, and this is the conduct disorders. So this one is diagnosed when children show an ongoing pattern of aggression towards others and serious violations of rules and social norms at home, in school, and with peers. So again, this is the definition from the CDC, and the examples that they give are breaking serious rules like running away, staying out at night when told not to, or skipping school, being aggressive in a way that causes harm, such as bullying, fighting, being cruel to animals, lying, stealing, or damaging other people's property on purpose. So these things are more acting out compared to what we'll be going over next with the emotional side of things. The behavioral ones are easier to spot for sure. Like if a kid's acting up in your class, or if a child is having what's here, possible criminal activities happening, that stuff's really easy to pick up on, and it's really easy to say, hey, maybe we should try and diagnose this. As teachers, it's going to, again, be hard because, like we put in our discussion forums, at a certain extent, we can only do so much. We can try and keep the child in the office. I think it was Cassidy or someone, one of the posts that I read was sometimes students want to leave the class rather than leave. So maybe sending them to the office isn't the best thing, especially with these behavioral issues. There's a lot of underlying things, and compared to some of the things like autism or intellectual development disorders, there's a lot more shades of gray here when it comes to trying to interpret everything that's going on. So, leading to the next thing is the emotional side of things is a question for you two. When we talk about depression and anxiety in our society, it's a pretty common thing and something we talk about a lot. So when we are talking about it, whether it be among our peers or friends or family or other adults in our lives, how do we address anxiety and depression? What are ways that we look for? What are things that we look for? How do we try and help people when this is going through? So, who wants to go first?
I'll go first. I think the two things I've learned lately is you've always got to find that trigger. You got to prevent the issue from starting in the first place. If you know what the trigger is, you can adjust accordingly. I think also too, you gotta really learn. You gotta teach them how to regulate themselves. I know my son, sometimes he just breaks down. He can't control himself. He would just be breathing very fast, or he would just get really upset. How he doesn't know how to regulate himself. He doesn't want to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that helps is a weighted blanket will calm him down. Now that may obviously look differently for an adolescent, but nevertheless, they'll need to shown how to regulate themselves properly.
Sure, that's a good point. Triggers and regulations are super important things. As adults, a lot of times they don't. If an adult recognizes that they have some kind of depression issue, if you go to therapy, the first thing they're going to say is don't put yourself in that situation. So as an adult and having the ability to recognize things, that's a really good point. What about you, Cassidy? What are some ways that you've seen the ways that we address depression and things like that when it comes to adults?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going off of what Ethan said about the just understanding the triggers, just to like kind of expand on that. As a teacher, I think it's important just to have so much patience and like compassion towards the students, and like make sure that they know that you do care, so that they can trust you to like tell you about maybe what's something going on in their lives that's causing them to act that way, just so you can understand it better instead of just trying to discipline them.
Sure. Do you guys think that we address depression differently for children than for adults? As in, like, do you think that that we may recognize depression and anxiety as in adults, and sometimes maybe inadvertently chalk that up when it comes to children, chalk that up to other issues? Do you think it's more common to diagnose in adults? Why or why not?
I don't really know. I don't know. I guess just as children are like they're exposed or they're in school, so I feel like they have a lot more eyes on them and a lot more people seeing the way that they act and interact with each other. And when you're adult, other people might not be able to recognize that you're having like these feelings, kind of. I don't know.
Good point.
Makes me think of children are struggling with EVDs, that it's probably some type of family background. Probably there's some type of abuse, and then they're acting out at school. Strike something, but I think us as adults, I know at my workplace, I'm just a shift manager at Culver's, and I see these teens act out, or they're not listening, or they're just swearing left and right. It just makes me think teenagers are just being teenagers, and they haven't really lived on their own to really know what the hard life is all about, and I could just easily undercut them. But in light of this week, there is some emotional damage that teenagers can experience when they feel ostracized, or when they're not feeling included within the environment they spend most of their time in.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I think a big part of that too is what we talk about, whether it's in this class or whether it be in something like ed psych class, where teens, for the most part, teens literally don't have a fully developed brain. when it comes to making decisions and things like that yet. So they tend to run on emotion. So I think as teachers sometimes it's hard to figure out, is what's happening here, is this more of like a developmental thing where they're trying to get used to what's happening and trying to adjust into adult life, or is it like a more pressing depression, anxiety thing? And I think that's where, again, this week compared to other weeks is much more gray in terms of trying to figure out what's happening and how the best way to address it is. So let's just kind of start. So anxiety and depression, fears and sadness are normal parts of childhood and the socialization process. So the kid growing up, if they're going to be away from if they're used to being with their mom all the time, and then they get dropped off at daycare, they're going to freak out. They're going to have anxiety. It's not going to be any fault of the kids, but they're just used to being with mom all day. However, the problems start to come up when issues arise, when the fears become more extreme, when they become crippling and not normal kids adjusting to life kinds of things. The problem with these anxiety and depression disorders is, unlike the behavioral disorders where they're externals, these thought spirals are internalized disorders, and they involve primarily thoughts and feelings. So trying to have a conversation with a child about internalized things can be much more difficult. Just imagine yourself when it comes to talking about your feelings, and if you're someone who experiences anxiety and depression, trying to talk about that's hard to do now as a grown person. And imagine being a kid trying to do it. It's an incredibly difficult process. Mm-hmm. There are symptoms, though, that we can observe, things like being afraid when they walk away from parents, having extreme fear about a specific thing or a situation, such as dogs, insects, going to the doctor, phobias. Again, those are things that could have been triggered before. They could be things that they have fear for no founded reason. Being very afraid of school and other places where they're with people, so social anxiety, like one of the videos that we were given this week to watch. Being very worried about the future and about bad things happening, so just general anxiety kinds of things. And having repeated episodes of sudden, unexpected, intense fear that come with symptoms like heart pounding, having trouble breathing, or feeling dizzy, shaky, sweating, panic attacks, something that a lot of us, even as adults, experience on a daily basis. Depression, though, is different. Where anxiety is that crippling, it's something that is a stress, and you feel stressed out a lot. Depression is something different. Depression, sadness, hopelessness, irritability, a lot of the time, not wanting to do or enjoy fun things, showing changes in eating a lot more, eating less, eating disorders, are a lot of things that come about because of depression one way or the other. Showing changes in sleep patterns, showing changes in energy, having a hard time paying attention, feeling worthless, useless, guilty, showing self-injury, self-destructive behavior. Looking at these symptoms, especially for depression, is kind of where I want us to kind of hone in. Do you think that these symptoms are things that are easy for educators to spot? Or do you think that there are things that are harder for teachers to spot?
Probably harder.
Yeah, why is that?
If they don't talk about what they're feeling or what they're thinking in their heads, and if they're not displaying physical characteristics, it's going to be really tough to try to know that they are experiencing these feelings.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with her, harder. I'm thinking right now for my, I think the narrative research paper this next week that we all have to do. And I'm thinking of a particular student, but he displays many symptoms, but we have learned a lot of, disorders these past 7 weeks, going on our 8th week now. And I'm thinking, okay, which category does he actually fit in? Does he fit in one? And maybe he fits in more. Like my son, he has been diagnosed with autism, but he also has a developmental delay, like what we discussed last week, which, I didn't really think about that way, but okay. Then what if he also has, in a sense, we all have some emotional, malfunction,
Mm-hmm.
but it just makes me think there's probably not just one cause that you could put somebody in a category. Mm-hmm. They may fit in different boxes.
Yeah. I think it's the hard thing with a lot of these things that we're talking about too. A lot of these emotional issues that we've been discussing, they're much harder to address kinds of things. So in the classroom then, as we're wrapping up, what do these educators experience the most? What have your experience with EBDs looked like? Do you think a child in your class may have EBDs or not be diagnosed? But I really want to focus on the last one real quick, just for the sake of time. What in your mind separates behavioral disorders from general disobedience?
Mhm. That's a great question. That's what I struggled with a lot throughout this, like this topic this week. And I mean, I haven't taught my own classroom yet, so that is something that I'm worried about. Or do I discipline this student because he's just not behaving and not listening, or is there something like really wrong, like a disorder? Like I'm nervous about that. So I don't really know the question for that because I haven't really experienced it yet.
I'm right there with you. For me, that's one of the things that stresses me. Not stresses me, but one of the biggest worries about teaching.
Mm-hmm.
What about you?
I'm not a pro by any means. I am guessing right now if somebody has a pattern or consistency of showing the symptoms of depression and anxiety. That is, I'm thinking of one student I was teaching before this quarantine thing happened. She had always kept to herself, never wanted to participate in answers, never wanted to do presentations. And it makes me think maybe she didn't want to speak up because she felt like she was going to give a wrong answer. Maybe she was just shy. Now, I mean, maybe she's just not motivated. There's a host of other problems, but if it's consistent, maybe it goes into the behavioral disorder. If it's just once in a while, just acting out, and it's not a consistent pattern, I would be leaning towards a general disobedience.
Yeah, I think that's the hard thing. So whether it be students with EBDs or students in general, there's a few things that we can kind of do to help the process along. So 5 things that I've seen in my research was keep class rules activities simple and clear so that students who have the who have the behavioral disorders can kind of see them. Reward positive behaviors. For the emotional, for students on the emotional side of things, that means let them know that they're valued and that they're worth and let them know that they have worth. And for behavioral disorders, let them know when they are doing good so that they know that they have that capability. Allow for mini breaks. With both of these groups of students, a lot of times focusing can be very difficult, and allowing time for the students to recoup and focus well can be a great thing. Fair treatment for all. You don't want to isolate students with behavioral disabilities, but they do need to be addressed, and that also means that students in the class who don't typically act up need to be addressed as well. And then use motivational strategies. This kind of comes down to the one-to-one relationships, but find out what fires up the student, what gets them excited, what motivates them, and use that to help them. So, final thoughts on the topics. Kids with emotional behavioral disorders, specifically with behavioral issues, they're not trying to make their lives harder. A lot of times they're going through behavioral issues. It's a whole host of other things. And this is just the way that they show their problems. And then behavioral orders may be more visible, but emotional issues are just as common and just as important to address. And that leads to my third point. Anxiety and depression disorders are a huge problem with kids today. And we need to do our best to not only look for emotional disorders, but to get children connected with the resources that can help them. Like we've kind of addressed, this is a much more gray topic than sometimes in the past. But for us as teachers, a lot of times we're with these students a big portion of the day. So we need to keep an eye out, be in contact with parents, administrators, counselors, all that kind of things, just so that these students have the resources they need and they stay safe and they don't hurt themselves or others. Well, in that case then, thank you very much, guys. That is my presentation for this week. And I thank you for your time and participation.
Yay.
Thank you.